Let me go ahead and offer just a brief introduction to this series. So welcome. This is Delivery Exception. If I can find my notes here, I have way too many things open. There we go. And our event today is a roundtable with the title Evaluating 25 Years of Supply Chain Solidarity. But I'm going to introduce you to the speaker series first. This is a series that brings together scholars and organizers to discuss logistical justice and examine the possibilities of reconciliation in our era of supply chain capitalism. I always start here with some credits. This event, which is free and open to the public, is also organized as part of the Supply Studies Research Network, a group of scholars, students, activists, and organizers who have identified their active interest in the critical study of logistics. With the research network itself supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities Office of Digital Humanities. Funding and additional support for the series is provided by the Conference of Arts and Science Deans and the Department of Communication and Media Studies here at Fordham. While as a virtual event, the geographies that have been enrolled in our gathering here today are many, I would like to acknowledge that Fordham itself occupies the ancestral lands of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger peoples. This is our final event in this series until we get more money, I guess, for future events. But I'd like to just very briefly recap the previous events that we've had. We started with Tamara Neese talking about AI supply chains. We had Jess Spear and Jessica Steinman talking about first scheduling ship pilots in the port of Rotterdam, and then the temporal inequalities among Vietnamese seafarers. We had Armin Beverangen, Ulf Traeger, and Miley Vogt talk about Amazon's logistical urbanism. We had Christina Dunbar Hester and Athena Tan have a conversation about Oil Beach, the Inland Empire in California, environmental politics, labor, logistics. And finally, most recently, we had Miriam Posner talking about how we see like supply chains through systems like SAP. All of the previous talks are available in video archive form at supplystudies.com/delivery exception. And that is just the embedded YouTube playlist there. But now I'd like to turn to our event today and talk about the speakers. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce everybody. I'm going to read everybody's bio here. This part is, I guess, somewhat, lengthy in terms of talking, but you can read all the text up there. This is evaluating 25 years of supply chain solidarity. We have Benjamin McKean, who's a political theorist whose research concerns global justice, populism, and the relationship between theory and practice. His research has been published in American Political Science Review, Political Theory, Journal of Politics, Critical Review of International Social and Political Philosophy, and elsewhere. His book, Disorienting Neoliberalism, Global Justice and the Outer Limit of Freedom, argues that people subject to unjust institutions and practices like transnational supply chains should be disposed to solidarity with others who are also subject to them. Before coming to Ohio State, he received his PhD from the Princeton University Department of Politics and was a Harper-Schmidt Fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Liberal Arts at the University of Chicago. Our second panelist, I guess in no particular order, is Jessica Champagne, who is the Deputy Director of Strategy and Field Operations for the Worker Rights Consortium, an independent labor rights monitoring organization. She coordinates investigations in apparel factories around the world and works to press international apparel brands and retailers to address violations of workers' rights. In addition to remedying health and safety violations, winning reinstatement of illegally fired workers, and pressing for the creation of binding programs like the International Accord for Health and Safety and the Lesotho anti-GBVH agreements, the WRC has assisted workers in recovering more than $110 million in back pay for garment workers. Prior to joining the WRC in 2010, Jessica worked for the Service Employees International Union, the Indonesian Society for Social Transformation, and the Urban Poor Consortium, as well as other organizations in the US and Indonesia. She is the recipient of a Heschel Vision Award from the Jews United for Justice and of a Fulbright Fellowship for Research in Indonesia, and a former member of the board of directors of the Diverse City Fund. Our third panelist is Morgan Currier, a regional director with the Committee of Interns and Residents, which represents over 30,000 resident physicians nationwide. She is passionate about supporting healthcare workers in their efforts to challenge our broken healthcare system. Prior to CIR, she organized retail and grocery workers with UFCW 21, now 3,000, in Seattle, Washington. She began her work in the labor movement as a student at the University of Washington, where she was a member of the United Students Against Sweatshops. As a member and eventually staff for the organization, she led successful campaigns against corporations like Nike, Adidas, and Sodexo. At the UW, she received the Martin and Ugam Scholarship in Labor Studies. Evangelina Argueta is the coordinator of the McKean Worker Organizing Project of the General Center for Workers in Choloma, Honduras, a major center for apparel export production. Evangelina has negotiated historic agreements with 3 major North American apparel brands, which has led to 50,000 workers forming or joining unions, being covered by collective bargaining agreements, and as a result, enjoying dignity on the job and improved wages and benefits. In the garment sector, she assists workers in establishing factory-level unions, addressing worker grievances through dialogue with employers, and negotiating collective bargaining agreements. More broadly, she plays a crucial role in the national labor movement on Honduras, including serving on national tripartite commissions and engaging with the Honduran government about key topics for low-wage workers. Argueta began working in the apparel industry at age 15 and was a founding member of the Citra Vincasa Union at her factory at age 16. Her leadership has inspired other women workers, and she is committed to encouraging more women to lead. So with that, I welcome you to Delivery Exception, and I think I'm going to hand it off to Ben McKean, who's going to begin, and then we'll go through each of the attendees with some remarks, and then open it up to questions. Ben.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, and thanks so much for having us. It's been a wonderful series, and I'm really excited for this conversation to be a part of it. When Matt invited me to be a part of the series, I thought that one of the things that's so, I think, exceptional about the supply chain research network is the way it does bring together academics and organizers. So it's not only interdisciplinary, but I think really attracting people from a variety of places. And I thought that this conversation would be a good one to have to actually evaluate the effectiveness of what I think is one of the most prominent forms of supply chain solidarity, one of the most visible efforts to achieve supply chain justice over the past several decades. And so I wanted to bring together other folks with experience in international solidarity around the apparel industry, particularly focused around campaigns that were run by United Students Against Sweatshops and the work of the Worker Rights Consortium, because I think that it's work that could perhaps be a model for other forms of solidarity. That's one of the things we'll talk about. And also I think is work that we can learn from, not only things to emulate, but maybe things to do differently. And also ways in which it might have been specific to its context. So I'm going to also start sharing the screen. I have some slides just to sort of introduce some of the background of these solidarity campaigns, since I'm not going to assume people on the webinar will be familiar with them. And to give a little background before I turn it over to the other panelists who've been involved in these campaigns in various kinds of different ways. So my own academic research is often about global justice, which comes out of my experience of actually organizing in solidarity with garment workers through these campaigns. And so my own sort of work as a theorist has been to understand neoliberalism and to put some of these campaigns in the context of neoliberalism. And I think that what I'd like to do is, as I said, give a little bit of historical context to some of these so that we have sort of shared basis of knowledge, which we can use to sort of evaluate the effectiveness of these campaigns. So I think a lot of this supply chain solidarity came out of a couple important, very visible moments in the 1990s when what I'm calling neoliberalism was more often called, globalization or corporate-driven globalization. And I think in particular, the sort of prehistory of some of these solidarity campaigns, I would start in 1992 when Unite, the US-based garment workers union, sued Guess Jeans for wage theft and other workers' rights violations at their manufacturing facilities in Los Angeles. Unite won a settlement with the support of the Department of Justice, and almost immediately afterwards, Guess announced that it was moving production to Mexico. They, of course, denied that that was related, but that was frankly unbelievable. And part of what that led to was a number of the organizers of the Guess campaign in Los Angeles following Guess to Mexico in order to continue their organizing and to continue the campaign. And that became an important sort of background in the sort of actual infrastructure of solidarity that followed. Of course, it's also important that in 1994, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, took effect, which is going to be an important background to the garment industry and to its mobility, and also to the rise of the anti-corporate globalization movement, the global justice movement, which many people suggest was sort of kicked off by the Zapatista uprising that accompanied the NAFTA going into effect. Within US popular culture, sweatshops were beginning to sort of return to consciousness, and there were two, I think, really key events that kicked that off. One was in 1995, when 72 workers who'd been victims of human trafficking from Thailand were rescued from literal enslavement in a garment factory in El Monte, California, which was obviously so egregious that it began more enforcement efforts around some of these things. And then a following year, Charlie Kernighan, who was the executive director of the National Labor Committee, made a huge splash with congressional testimony revealing that apparel that had been licensed, produced under the Kathy Lee Gifford name, and being sold at Walmart was being made by teenagers in sweatshops in Honduras. Now, Kernighan's model was not necessarily a solidarity-based model in various ways, but I think that the way in which his intervention led to more attention to these issues was important. And partly in response to that, in 1997, the Clinton administration announced the Apparel Industry Partnership, which tried to convene apparel companies, US labor unions, and human rights groups to address some of this. At the same time, on the labor side, Unite was continuing its work to support garment workers, not only in the US, but abroad where production had moved. And as part of that, the summer of 1997, when in general the US labor movement was trying to push towards engaging college students, was also around the same time that the union summer program was in effect. Unite brought a cohort of college student interns to New York to figure out how to organize students around sweatshop issues. And one of the things that they realized was that universities were really strategic actors here. College logo apparel at the time was estimated by the Collegiate Licensing Company to be about a $2.5 billion market. And now, 25 plus years later, it's probably closer to 5 billion. It's almost doubled in size. So one of the things that they realized was none of these companies, as powerful as they are, could produce Ohio State apparel, Georgetown apparel, and so forth without permission from the universities. And so the universities became key points of leverage because those licensing contracts were something that students could have real power over. And so starting in 1997 and in 1998, campus Students Against Sweatshop chapters formed with the idea of using that student power to create enforceable codes of conduct that would prevent universities from just licensing to anybody, but create enforceable labor standards for college licensed apparel. And as part of that, in the spring of 1998, many universities hosted a campus worker tour. Workers from the BJ&B cap factory in the Dominican Republic, which was making collegiate licensed hats for Nike and Reebok. And you can see here one of the original pieces of sort of outreach literature that students used to reach other students. And you can see sort of the signature from many of the sort of founding members of USAS there. In the years that followed, there's been a lot of interest in pursuing this because it was both a strategic campaign and one that promised to be effective. It was also one that resonated very widely with all of these issues going on in the culture. So in the summer of 1998, USAS had its first summer conference, and by the spring of 1999, it was doing its first building occupations as students at Duke had a sit-in demanding the university adopt an enforceable code of conduct to create working standards, enforceable working standards for college logo apparel. And they won the sit-in, obviously giving rise to more momentum there. Also in the background, of course, at the end of 1999 is massive protests at the Seattle WTO summit, the battle in Seattle. Again, putting all of these issues really in front of a wide number of students who might not have been exposed to it and making this international solidarity work feel very important, right? At the same time, it was also clearly important to the Clinton administration. In the meantime, the apparel industry partnership had fallen apart. Unions and NGOs, some of the NGOs had walked away over the company's refusal to include enforceable language around living wage and freedom of association. But the Clinton administration was not dissuaded, and they formed what is called the Fair Labor Association, which immediately began reaching out to universities to become affiliates as a way to replace some of the legitimacy that had been lost by having these other groups walk away. All during this time, of course, student protests are continuing, sit-ins are continuing, demanding not just enforceable codes of conduct, but also full disclosure of factory locations so that people could actually know where the factories producing college logo apparel were. The natural follow-on from that demand is to then go have people who can inspect the factories and respond to worker complaints in them. The FLA had promised it would do that, but refused then to release any of the inspections that it would do. This is also at a time when corporate monitoring groups like PricewaterhouseCoopers were still trying to do labor standards monitoring, which they've mostly abandoned. So students and others founded the Worker Rights Consortium as an independent alternative to the FLA, which is a pretty remarkable thing for a student-led movement to do, to try and create a effective kind of labor enforcement arm. It only began with one member university, which is Brown University, not a notable college sports powerhouse. And so it was able to grow from there, again, through student power. At its height, I think the WRC had something like more than 180 schools, and it still has about, I believe, 145 today. The WRC began its first investigations the following year, releasing an investigative report about violations at the Cookdong apparel factory in Atlixco, Mexico, where Nike and Reebok were producing college licensed apparel. That was among other things, a freedom of association case where workers were sort of corralled into a yellow union, a company union that was selling them out, and workers wanted an independent union. And through solidarity organizing through USAS, those workers were able to win an independent union, and students were able to take the WRC report to the universities and say, here's concrete, objective information. You need to enforce the code of conduct that we've already forced you to adopt. Right. And I think it was, and almost immediately, of course, it wasn't just international solidarity. One of the other early campaigns was around the New Era Cap Factory in Derby, New York, outside of Buffalo, where workers who were members of CWA, the Communication Workers of America, were experiencing union busting, also major health and safety violations at the plant. Again, using the power of college licensing, USAS was able to organize solidarity campaigns and help those workers keep the factory open and win a new contract. And that, of course, keeping the factory open is going to be a big theme in what follows. So I've got here also on the slide a picture from one of the workers from the Cookdong campaign who was doing campus tours. Also, one of the things that I found in preparing for this was that the Clinton administration's email correspondence about all of these efforts to try and stop the student movement and defend neoliberalism. All of their emails are now online through the Clinton Presidential Library, which is actually quite interesting. So you can see here, this was an early effort by the Clinton administration to pressure United Students Against Sweatshops to join the Fair Labor Association, the FLA, which is the sort of corporate run, whitewashing group at the time. And then I would say, in a certain respect, this early sort of first era of really kind of explosive effectiveness and explosive growth ended pretty early with the terrorist attacks of September 11th, where a lot of student energy very quickly became devoted to anti-war efforts and directing to stop the invasion of Iraq. Also, of also significance, that was also, of course, the year that China joined the WTO, which will have a lot of implications for the international solidarity that follows. There were many other victories that we'll talk about today. In 2003, the BJ&B cap factory, whose worker tour kind of kicked off this effective international solidarity, won a new union contract. But it wasn't much later that in 2006, the BJ&B factory closed and production was relocated to Bangladesh. One of the reasons for that was the expiration of the multi-fiber arrangement, which was the sort of GATT-era agreement governing textile import quotas that was phased out as part of the move from the GATT to the WTO, which created a new era of real capital mobility for apparel. The last sort of event that I'm going to highlight before I turn it over to Jess, who will talk about things from the Worker Rights Consortium side, is just to highlight the campaign and the victory that you'll hear more about from Eva, which is about the solidarity campaign with Russell Athletic workers in Honduras, where Russell Athletics responded to worker organizing in one of their factories by firing more than 1,200 workers and closing the factory in response to that organizing. This is an unusual situation in that Russell owned the factories directly. It was not through subcontracting that this production was happening. Students mobilized massively in this case. More than 90 schools cut or suspended contracts with Russell, which is an enormous amount of a big business hit for Russell's business to take. And eventually, because of the solidarity between workers and students, Russell was forced to reopen the factory and to recognize the union, not only at that factory, but at all of their factories in Honduras. So I think in a lot of ways that represents the high point, the sort of biggest success of this model of supply chain solidarity that was developed during this time. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jess, and then we'll hear from other folks about their perspectives on these efforts.
Thanks, Ben. It was great to see some of those old pictures and that context. And I really appreciate also, as Ben said, being invited to be part of the series. And it's really exciting to see people coming together, both academic and practitioner, and also across sort of different sectors of the economy, looking at supply studies. And I know our research director at WRC has appreciated like the resources and discussions that have been part of this. So I'm really excited about this academic focus and formulation. So thank you to Matt. I think Ben gave a really great summary of sort of the first decade of student activism on this issue and of the WRC. And I think one thing I want to lift up is that, there's a really key contrast between what workers and their allies have been demanding and what the industry has done, which is that at the beginning of the period that Ben discussed, the apparel brand's position generally was that they had no responsibility for any of this, not their employees. These weren't their employees. They didn't own these factories. For those doing work in other sectors, this may sound very familiar. But they quickly pivoted to the line that they take now, which is that the brands have this under control. There's no need for any outside scrutiny or accountability, which of course poses some pretty obvious problems and questions. And I think what was so insightful about students and others creating these university codes of conduct was that they created an opportunity to drive real legal accountability. in this case, from the brands to the universities, in which universities had a contractual basis to end their relationship with apparel brands if the brands violated those codes of conduct, which of course had financial and reputational consequences for the brands if it was very public that, for example, University of Michigan had said that they couldn't make any more Go Blue t-shirts or things like that. And as Ben described, that new accountability really allowed workers, students, universities, the WRC, and other partners to achieve real wins during the first decade. And we'll hear more about that from Eva and Morgan. But it's always been clear that there are limitations to these sort of factory by factory fights. The apparel sector is marked by high mobility, as I'm sure people are aware. In this sector, as in others, brands are making short-term commitments to factories. They shift orders to the cheapest, fastest manufacturers. And it's always been challenging to prevent this kind of slow erosion of victories, like what Ben described at BJ&B, where the brands initially engaged and then sort of slowly reduced their orders until the factory closed. So I'm going to take a minute to explain WRC a little bit more and then talk about kind of what the focus has been for the past decade in our work together with workers and other workers and others. So as Ben said, we're really created as a result of the student pressure and creativity to be an independent fact finder. We have field staff in a dozen garment producing countries where our team is building long-term relationships with workers, unions, women's rights groups, human rights groups, the people on the ground, so that when workers' rights are violated in garment factories, they know that they can come to us, that we'll document what's happening, we'll protect their confidentiality, and do our best to protect them from retaliation. And we'll push for justice in those cases and really engage with the brands at the top of the supply chain, with universities, and with other stakeholders to try to push for change. And when we do this kind of investigation, we report publicly on it. We really prize transparency. And we also share information with our university affiliates so that they can choose to take action, just as Ben mentioned, as they have done in prior cases where, universities choosing to end or suspend contracts with licensees has driven real change in brand behavior. And so over the past decade, we've maintained that focus on responding to workers who approach the WRC with individual or collective struggles. But we've also tried to find opportunities to create direct accountability from brands to workers and really shifting power so that workers have channels to directly hold brands accountable to their commitments and obligations. And I'm going to touch on kind of two ways that I think we've tried to do that together with partners like Ava. One is sort of setting a new precedent case by case by case. So in 2010, Ava's members were fired from 2 factories in Honduras and were owed a lot of severance pay when the factories closed. This is a really common problem in the garment sector, that severance pay is baked into the legal obligations that companies have. It's a major issue for workers because if a factory closes, there may not be other social safety net programs. The severance may be really the thing they need to tide them over to find a new job. And it's often the largest amount of money that a worker can, will ever have in their lifetime. And so in this case, Ava and USAS and other groups were able to use WRC documentation to really push on, in that case, Nike, to make sure that workers received the money they were owed. The factory owner was gone, out of the picture, as often happens. And so Nike had to make good on those payments. And factory by factory, building on the university codes, on the company's stated commitments to preventing wage theft, we've been able to really shift the norm so that now it's much more broadly accepted among apparel companies that they're going to have some obligations if a factory closes and doesn't pay its workers. There have been some very hard-fought cases. Morgan will remember the Keyzone case in which Nike actually made an early commitment to provide funds, but Adidas held out for many months, and workers were ultimately able to recover more than $3 million for 2,800 workers in Indonesia. There's a recent case called Style Avenue. I'll pop a couple links in the chat after I finish talking, including one to this case that just resolved this month, in which workers are going to receive millions of dollars in Central America. And so overall, using this kind of approach of using emblematic cases and calling on the commitments that brands have made and their obligations to universities, we've been able to recover more than $110 million in severance theft and other forms of wage theft with 500,000 workers. The other piece of this is really creating enforceable brand agreements. The most notable example of this is the Bangladesh Accord, which is now the International Accord for Health and Safety in the Garment Industry. But people probably know the broad outlines of this. Bangladesh was a deadly place for garment workers. There was a series of fires and building collapses over many years, culminating in the Rana Plaza collapse in 2013, in which more than 1,100 workers died. And it was very clear that the brand's approach was not keeping people safe. And so under pressure from Bangladeshi unions and their international allies, including students, 200 brands signed a legally binding commitment covering more than 2,000 factories to ensure that those factories were made safe. If the factories didn't comply, all the Accord signatory brands would stop sourcing from the factory. And if the brands didn't ensure compliance, they could be taken to arbitration, which was in fact necessary in some cases. Through this, more than 150,000 safety hazards were identified and fixed, and factories that were really death traps were either moved or suspended production until they could make their buildings safe. That started just over 10 years ago. It's now expanded to Pakistan, and there's a recent agreement that's paving the way for more expansion. And the Accord is just an amazing case study, and the difference it makes when workers are able to seize the momentum of a specific moment, like the Rana Plaza collapse, to win a binding agreement that holds brands accountable to their commitments, even after the newspaper headlines and the TV news have moved on. And so I'll stop there to hand it over to Ava, whose perspective I'm always really eager to learn from. But there's additional examples of this model, including around gender-based violence and harassment in Lesotho and Southern Africa. And there's some key principles, which are sometimes called worker-driven social responsibility, that really we have seen as the most effective approach, and something that we're focusing on a lot in thinking about how we can really make sure that those wins survive and are institutionalized. With that, I'll pass it over to Ava.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much. In the case of Honduras, and this impacted too, I have to say, at the level of Central America, we've been able to advance in the organizing sector. When in 2007 or 8, the conflict with UCEL, the UCEL-owned jersey factory, when the workers started to organize a union, that automatically meant closing. So workers are really afraid of unionizing. It was a very troublesome, very worrying situation, because the companies would do whatever they pleased, and the government did not have any kind of support towards the workers. And we, as workers' organizations, as unions, we lacked experience in carrying on international campaigns. We had very little experience. And so from 2007 and 8 on, having the strategic alliance was a great message, so these global supply chains would understand that there are workers' rights, that even if codes of conduct establish or dispose or express certain obligations for these corporations. In practice, this is not true. It doesn't work as such. Codes of conduct for these brands, in many cases, are just an image, but their actions are different. We can say that after the campaign that we had, that happened in 2009, and the great message that we were able to communicate to the global chains was that workers have rights, a fundamental right to having a workers' organization with agreements, with work agreements. So the things to highlight are the solidarity, the support we had with the organizations like college students, like universities, because as universities are the consumers of the products that are being made for the university apparel, sportswear, 99% of the production in Honduras, it goes to the United States. So the message of having told Russell that they had 7 factories in Honduras and the only one to unionize was the one they shut down, there's no justification for that. There's no excuse. Also, their international evaluations they ran were not very honest either. When we saw that WRC was doing an investigation and addressed us and said, yes, this is the truth, this is the truth, this is what's happening. That's when we started saying, okay, we need allies, we need strategic allies of this quality. So out of those 7 companies that existed, they went and shut down the only one that had a union, 1,200 workers right in the middle of the bargaining agreement negotiations, were notified that the factory closed and they were left jobless. What once this factory denied these workers their jobs, the other factories all got in agreement to also close their doors to these workers. And what was the result? It was basically clearly the fact that if you were in a union, you would have no work. So when we connect with the students, we had the opportunity to initiate a campaign. And I can say today that 110 universities cut their contracts with Russell Corp. And this is one of the most important international campaigns that we had. It was ongoing for a year, and the students were escalating it more and more, and that was a really important victory for us. When it got to the point that the company could not resolve this problem anymore, they called the union in the US and we were able to sit down and actually sign an agreement with them. The biggest message there was that they reopened the factory, that they gave back their jobs to those 1,200 workers, and that returned that self-confidence and that trust to all the workers. So after that message of the factories closed to we reopened the factory, that was the best message that we could have asked for. Today in Honduras, 62% of maquilas in Honduras are unionized. And in the case of my organization, we have 22 unions. We represent 40,000 workers. 95% of them have bargaining agreements. So we can proudly say that it was a great advance. And this was the result of a campaign of allied organizations in the United States. Alone in Honduras, we would not be able to do this. So in this On the topic we're addressing today, 25 years of solidarity, supply chain solidarity, we can positively say that we have advanced, but global supply chains still have anti-union behaviors and conducts. They still abuse workers' rights. I think that if we didn't exist as defenders of the rights of workers, these global chains would be committing much worse violations. We're at the front line of all these fights. We've had great successes like the Nike campaign. There was one day that the workers found a sign at the gate of the factory that said, factory's closed, and in two different factories in Honduras, and they said, there's nothing else, there's no more here. They lost years and years of work there. They didn't pay them a single dollar. So the campaign against Nike that helped us so much gave back to the workers 100% of their benefits, of their income. And it was really impactful as well. So, and when the Jersey, Honduras factory reopens, and when they see that Nike had to pay the workers, those were some really strong messages. And the industry in Honduras said, no, we can't keep having this happening. And the workers said, well, we feel like we've achieved union freedom. So after these great successes in Honduras, we have coordinated with other organizations in Honduras. We have an open dialogue with industrialists. We have bilateral commissions. We've come to agreements on health and safety, on minimum wage agreements, and we're currently the workers who, with the employer delegates and the government, we come to these agreements that we all co-sign to decide wages and conditions in the maquilas. And you can see plainly the results of our efforts. So it's important, this conversation where we're looking back on these 25 years of solidarity, but we also still have to keep telling these great corporations that they must improve their conduct. We still see violations, we still see impacts. We need that international solidarity from students, from the organizations that have been our allies for long, and our strategic allies, and we'll keep being each other's strategic allies. You can't imagine the amazing effect of the workers getting that piece of news one day that, oh, the factory is opening up again, or that you've just lost your job of so many years, and that they got Nike to, which did not own the factory, it was subcontracted, but and to say that there's no legal claim here, but yes, there was legal claim, and yes, you do have rights, you do have legal rights before the workers because this factory makes your product. So I think I may be out of time, I'm not sure, but I can tell you that this has been a success and that we will keep lodging all the complaints or all the denouncements that we can. And there's been, right, there's like the Gildan Corporation in Honduras is completely unionized. We had some difficulties with them, with the right to unionize. Also, with the Hanes brand, we've made great progress as well. And with other corporations that are headquartered, that are based here in Honduras, and the employer sector says it too. that they used to be really anti-union in 2008, but today the employer sector declares that having allowed, it wasn't in their hands to allow, but to respect it. But when they say that having allowed that possibility today, they say that it was a good decision because dialogue is the main thing in all spaces. We've resolved difficult conflicts. We've lived through difficult conflicts like the pandemic. This last year, 2023, was really critical in Honduras. We lost 40,000 jobs, and we've been right up front trying to see what we can resolve. There's hope now that the industry is picking up again and that we're newly reinitiating or livening up again. So thank you to the international organizations, to WRC, to the student comrades. We have felt a lot of that in the last few years, and we're here to see what we can keep resolving with this international connection. So thank you, comrades, for being here in this event as well, in this panel.
So I think Morgan is going to share a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll be brief here since I know we're coming towards the end. Everyone, thanks for having me. It's good to be reunited with all of my all these panelists who I know from organizing work. So I joined USAS as a student at the University of Washington in 2009, and I was with the organization for about 6 years, although as an alumni, you never really get to leave the USAS movement, so that's why I'm here. And preparing for this was actually great. I got to be flooded with lots of memories. So very briefly, I'm going to sort of summarize some of our strategy from the last 15 years, sort of picking up from where Ben left off and elaborating on what Ava and Jess and Ben were talking about. So in the last 15 years or so, we've ran a number of successful campaigns. So building off the Russell campaign that everyone's been talking about, we really harnessed our power by continuing to strategically target brands. I'd say the two criteria that we were most interested in were like brands that were being manufactured in factories where workers were actively organizing, and two, brands that had large contracts with universities. So this mostly left us with what we call the big three, Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, and then others like Russell that Ava had been talking about. We cared a lot about these contracts because they were big. I think Jess mentioned Michigan. It's funny, I picked Michigan too as an example. In 2016, the University of Michigan signed an agreement with Nike that was worth $173.8 million over 15 years. So we're still in that contract with options for bonuses depending on how the sports teams do. So brands will really pay top dollar to sponsor sports teams and have rights to university logos because of the marketing opportunities to young consumers. So we really seized upon that. Our campaign strategy never relied completely on overhauling the use of sweatshop labor in one fell swoop. That's not possible. So we aimed, as Jess had said, at having incremental successes. Our approach was really to zero in on a labor dispute communicated by workers to the WRC to create new precedents in the industry, while also engaging both students and workers so that we could build a movement that just got stronger and stronger. So following the Russell campaign, it was talked about how Nike pulled orders from their subcontracted factories in Honduras. And because they were subcontracted, surprise, surprise, Nike refused to claim any responsibility, refused to pay severance. We call this cutting and running. It's still obviously a rampant in the global apparel industry. Because we had a lot of momentum coming out of the Russell campaign, where we talked about cutting contracts with over 90 schools. This time we cut contracts with 2 universities, and Nike sort of got the message pretty quick after that and agreed to pay $2 million in severance to workers in Honduras because they saw sort of where our campaign was headed. We used a similar strategy following that when Adidas refused to pay about 1.8 million in severance to workers in Indonesia, which Jess talked about. Students, we ran campaigns, we pressured schools citing the code of conduct, and after 18 contract cuts, Adidas also agreed to pay workers. So we just really tackled the brands one by one. And although what I just talked about accounts for years of successes and many, many workers impacted by these successes. Our strategy of cutting contracts brand by brand was kind of like playing whack-a-mole, and it wasn't really taking the offensive approach that we needed to make more systematic changes in the industry. And additionally, you know, I think you could say that when we would cut a contract with one brand, we would just bring in another brand. So if we cut Adidas, we'd bring in Nike, because there's not a lot of brands that can have these what we call sideline agreements with the university. So it kind of just felt like we were going in circles a little bit. So we tried some other strategies, and I'm not really going to hold back about their effectiveness, because I think that will help us have a more interesting conversation. But Ben spoke about the BJ&B factory in the Dominican Republic, where the union had been recognized. It was acquired by Knights Apparel, who agreed to work with the union to maintain the factory. And the factory was called Altagracia, which also became the brand, and they produced university apparel. So we kind of took a new approach there. Instead of putting out fires, we tried to say, hey, what would it look like if we push for this brand to be sold in stores? The reality was a unionized factory required large quantities of orders, and they kind of couldn't compete on their own with Nike and Adidas. So we took it on, and across the country, we met with bookstore managers and bookstore CEOs to demand that they stock more Altagracia and less of other brands that rely on sweatshop labor. So with this, we wanted to do two things: support the unionized factory financially, so it stayed in business, and support those workers. And then two, prove that this model was viable. And, you know, a lot of, at the time, big brands were swearing that, you know, it wasn't financially sustainable to have unionized factories and to own the factories directly. We wanted to prove that that wasn't the case. There were some problems with this approach. For one, bookstores often gave priority to big brands for more visually appealing logos. So when Altagracia was stuck with like unpopular designs, the stores would say, hey, they're not selling. And we'd say they're not selling because you're giving priority to the big brands to have the cooler logos in their stores. Then this kind of got weird because it got students wrapped up in campaigns that were more like business meetings. So that kind of took an interesting turn with the movement. Ultimately, we did a lot to support Altagracia. I myself went down to the factory at one point, met with the union down there to learn about their work and how we could support them. But it was very hard to maintain, constantly fighting with bookstores to stock this apparel in their stores, and it was on a very small scale. So another approach was the Designated Suppliers Program, or the DSP. Here we envisioned a system where universities had to source the majority of their apparel from factories where workers had the right to unionize and were paid a living wage. These factories would be on a list that was compiled by the WRC. Universities also had to agree to source from these factories long-term, which is an important, I think, it's a criteria that we want brands and universities to agree to is investment in the factories and to pay enough to ensure the factories could meet compliance obligations. So there was a 3-year phase-in of the program, and eventually our goal was to have 75% of a university bookstore sourced from the factory list. So we worked with global union partners, and we really thought that we could create a shift that was big enough to, in a big way, put power back in the hands of workers instead of just, you know, penalizing brands one by one. So in 2006, I think it was, after a wave of campaigns across the country, USAS did get dozens of schools to sign on to the program, which was a really big deal. It was a big ask. We really needed widespread buy-in to make this possible. We needed a lot of schools to agree to it. However, it was halted by the Department of Justice. I think they was citing antitrust concerns. And so we had to put a pause on it. By the time it was greenlit later, I think it was under the Obama administration, a lot of the momentum was lost, and we had already moved on to some other campaigns. So that was really challenging. And then another iteration of this concept was the sweat-free bookstore program. That was in such an infant stage, we actually didn't even have a proper campaign name for it. We just called it the sweat-free bookstore program. In 2014, I was on USAS staff. I actually visited Ava down in Honduras. We had a great time. I met with the CGT to discuss challenges facing their union, their priorities. And then we actually arranged for Fruit of the Loom to take me on a tour of some of the factories so we could discuss a possible, very rare partnership, right? So that we could figure out a way to ensure that the unionized factories were staying afloat and staying competitive. And I have to say that when I went to the factory and saw workers on the factory line wearing USAS shirts, that was like an unforgettable, very cool moment. The goal of this campaign was to do a version of the DSP and demand universities stock a percentage of their apparel from factories where there was a democratically elected union. This was an evolution from the DSP because it didn't require a majority of universities to adopt it. They could just do it independently, like one at a time. And so for this, we targeted independent bookstores where they had more autonomy over their purchasing. This didn't really take off, didn't get too far because unfortunately around the same time, Nike decided that they no longer were going to allow independent auditors like the WRC to access their factories, and stated that they would actually measure their compliance using their own internal code of conduct. As you can imagine, that would disrupt, if successful, the entire foundation of USAS's strategy and our movement, and of course, really, really hurt workers who rely on their connection to the WRC to be able to speak up about their working conditions. So we had to put all of our energy, again, playing defense and going back to cutting contracts with Nike to try to reverse this policy, which eventually we did do. And I'll just say, so, you know, we've tried a number of strategies, all in coordination with global unions to try to build the student worker movement and to reverse exploitation trends in the global apparel industry. Many have been extremely successful, like you've heard about today. But I think, of course, there's so much work to be done. We still have a lot, I think, that we can do to rebuild our student labor movement. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You know, I'm going to speak for everyone, everybody who's here now and everybody who's going to listen to this in the future, that was incredibly motivating to hear, you know, all these stories of success, you know, from Eva and everyone. And it's, you know, it is really exciting and motivating to think about all these successes. But I'm gonna go into some questions that the panelists, you know, brainstormed a little bit and put my own inflection on them. You know, it is nice to think about the successes, but of course there are lots of challenges. And I guess I have two questions. One which, you know, the panelists brainstormed. And one that I'll just throw in there as a little sub question. But yeah, what successes have been the most long lasting, I guess? You know, the question of, you know, backsliding, right? This is a, you know, sort of constant problem. Successes are achieved, but then, you know, labor shifts, you know, companies find new subcontractors, you know, are union factories competitive, right? As we just heard, you know, I mean, it's really motivating, you know, to hear Eva talk about Honduras and, you know, the sort of, you know, freedom, you know, the union freedom that has been built up there. But, you know, are there successes that have been more long lasting? And a little sub question, since I know we have, and this is just a fun, easy question, since I know we have a couple students who are listening live here, you know, any suggestions for students who are, you know, hearing these successes and want to get involved in labor organizing, just as, you know, a fun thing if you want to throw in how you can as a student get involved in, you know, thinking about labor and organizing. But yeah, does anyone want to sort of talk about what successes they feel have been the most long lasting, which successes have been more short term or temporary? I mean, temporary successes can be great too, right? You know, that's, you know, potentially, you know, people having jobs for, you know, making money, you know, living lives, but, you know, it might not be for, you know, decades and decades.
I mean, I'm sort of tempted to invite Jess to go first because the existence of the Worker Rights Consortium itself is obviously one of those long-lasting victories that is an enduring kind of achievement of the movement.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. I think I had been involved in student organizing at about the same time as Ben, and I went and lived abroad in Indonesia. And when I came home, you know, 5 years out of college, I like couldn't believe that the WRC was a real place with a real office and a real field team. And 20 years later, I do think that that's like one example of how we've been able to sort of institutionalize it, is that kind of, whether you want to think of it as a complaint mechanism or an advocacy tool, we've been able to preserve that. I think, there's sort of maybe two ways that I think, the accord is one example of when you're able to take that moment where there's pressure, there's a crisis, and turn it into a binding commitment. And so I think, that's had its own challenges, but I think that's one good example. The work in Honduras, for sure. The way that is, I think, also an interesting example, because there it was really worker power that meant that this achievement of the initial Washington Accord or Washington Agreement between Fruit of the Loom and the CGT was turned into subsequent agreements, not just with Fruit of the Loom, but with Haynes, with Gildan, these big North American manufacturers, and turned into something that had a broader movement effect. So that's one example of how gains can be perpetuated, not only because there's something on paper, not maybe even primarily because there's something on paper, but because of constant mobilization and organizing. So I think those are two examples, amidst kind of, as you noted, the challenges of preserving some of those gains. I'll say on the question of, what people can do, I did put into the chat, there's a list of the WRC affiliate universities. I do think that, the more affiliates the WRC has, the more we're able to engage with the brands and be heard. So definitely always interested in talking to students or faculty who are interested in having their entity, their institution affiliate to WRC, or interested in knowing kind of how engaged their university is. So I think that's something more broad. Morgan can speak more broadly to what students can do, but that's my little piece.
Yeah, Ava or Morgan? Or I have more questions.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think one thing I would just add to what Jess said is that part of what I think made the WRC enduring is not just, as it were, the mechanism of membership, but also the fact that universities are committed to like pay a membership fee. And so there's a dedicated revenue stream, which makes a huge difference. And it's not sufficient for all the work that the WRC does, but I do think that it is it's a very significant kind of thing for universities to do. I mean, it is literally putting their money where their mouth is, and it means that they're really putting resources at the disposal of people who are trying to support and be in solidarity with workers, which I think is really important. The other thing I'll highlight, I guess, is in a certain sense, one of the enduring achievements of this solidarity effort in some ways moves away from the question of supply chain solidarity, but it is about what Morgan mentioned, which is the kind of alumni network of student activists who became involved in the labor movement through this work. And many of them, remain there. That in fact, I think there's an enormous number of people who became full-time organizers out of that experience. And I think that the learning that they've done has led, people to all kinds of different places, from labor law to, union organizing to some folks are in elected office now out of that experience. And I do think that that's also something I would point to as a kind of enduring achievement, even as, the tide in some ways really did kind of turn and a lot of the efforts became more defensive. And I think you sort of heard from Morgan about the efforts, the challenges moving beyond the kind of fire alarm model of just responding to problems that are popping up at particular factories. But I don't know if Morgan or Eva want to add anything.
I mean, I'll just totally agree that I joke I got a degree in history, but I really got a degree in labor organizing at the University of Washington, just through being a part of this movement and learning how to strategically organize with workers who do it better than anyone down in their factories in Honduras or Bangladesh or Indonesia. And that's really special. And as Ben said, a lot of folks have stuck around the labor movement one way or the other. And I think that is, I think it's just critical to like having people, learn about our work through college and stick with it for, sometimes a lifetime.
Yeah, I just want to read into the record here this useful link that Ben put in the chat, that students can start a chapter of Students for International Labor Solidarity at www.silsmovement.org, which is well, I can ask another question here, which, I mean, one of the things, of course, about thinking about supply chain solidarity and framing this in the context of the supply chain is the sort of global nature of supply chains, the constant, shifting from place to place to place as prices change, labor costs change, companies, are so ready to cut ties, right? If they can, if, someone's not watching them. And that raises the question about, solidarity across countries, global solidarity. The question that was brainstormed was, what can be done to facilitate worker to worker solidarity? And in particular framing here about, how can we be in solidarity with workers in a place like, say, China, right? How can lessons from places like Honduras, resonate in a place like China or a place like Indonesia or a place like Vietnam, right? What is the sort of translatability maybe of, different kinds of things, or more direct forms of solidarity, particularly in places where there are maybe harsh restrictions, crackdowns on communication freedom, things like that. How can we think about that, worker to worker solidarity? How can we think about global solidarity? How can we think about translating these lessons?
Ava, do you want to share any thoughts on that? On how we can build cross international worker solidarity from worker to worker? I know we've got a little translation lag.
Yeah, we have a translation
Yo quería
delay.
decir algo. ¿Sí?
Okay. Yes, I'd like to say something.
Cuando la primera pregunta también el éxito que más
with regards to the first question too, which about the biggest success,
el éxito que más ha durado para
nosotros, the longest lasting success for us in the case of Honduras
que a nivel internacional y a nivel
has
mundial
been
se
that
sigue manteniendo porque
the success that it's still maintained internationally and globally. One of the main things that we learned was that there was agreement, an agreement that was signed on with this global corporation, with the global chain. And we included like a follow-up, like a compliance attachment to it. If agreements cannot be monitored, cannot be overseen, then it comes to nothing. Even if it looks nice at the moment, if it looks great right then. If we don't follow up, if we don't supervise, and you don't have that lasting victory. That's something else that we saw, I think, in Bangladesh as well. The compliance piece, the following up piece. So these corporations are really clear that they're being looked at by international organizations, by students, right, and that they're well aware that they can't allow to keep, or they won't be allowed to keep up with the violations. Another victory is to maintain that solidarity, to keep those links alive, to keep these organizations alive. In Honduras, we've been really concerned and paying attention, and we're really glad that there's an organization of students that are lining up to keep doing that work that was done back in those years with USAS, and that we want to stay in contact and solidarity, united with organizations which have allowed for making this, for creating this social justice. We'll only be able to build social justice with unity, with solidarity, with organizations such as those that you represent.
Would anyone else like to chime in on what Ava just said, or thinking about that translation worker to worker solidarity question?
I think it's a great question. There's a lot of potential when you look, including in Central America. We have seen, for example, unions coming together to say, okay, we all work for the same supplier, or we all work for the same brand, and bringing demands together. And I think it's been exciting through Clean Clothes campaign, which sort of started in Europe, but now has membership and leadership across Asia, although less in Latin America, to see union leaders from Cambodia, Indonesia, Bangladesh become sort of like strategic leaders in thinking about how to bring that together. I think there's so many, there are real challenges in finding the right moments and points of intervention for workers to raise their voices together. But I think it's like something that has so much potential, and that people are still trying to figure out, with different experimentation about where to find those right moments.
Yeah, of course. I like the idea of, being able to recognize your place in the supply chain, right? Who are you working for alongside other people who are also working for, which those relationships, once we get to this, sort of web of subcontracting and obfuscation, can be quite difficult to determine how you are connected to other workers at other geographies along the supply chain. So even, just recognizing that sort of commonality. Yes, we're all working for Nike at some level here, and understanding that relationship is itself a sort of important victory. I have maybe we have time for this one last question. I don't want to go too far into 7:30 here, but I think this is an interesting question. That was brainstormed earlier about the sort of focus on what amounts to private regulation, by the WRC or by universities, as opposed to, and obviously, as Ava talks about, there is a role for thinking about legislative victories that enshrine these things, but as opposed to working directly for legislation, and thinking about this in the context of the United States and supply chains. We have so little supply chain regulation in the United States, right? We have, are you sourcing, coltan from the Congo? And if you're not doing that, then basically there's no regulation that applies to you. Maybe if you're in California, there's a little bit more regulation, although based on the conversation with Christina Dunbar Hester and Athena Tan that we had earlier in this series, maybe that regulation doesn't have a lot of bite if there are big corporate interests and big money involved. So is it a more effective strategy to think about, targeting places like universities, speaking to, the customers, or, intermediate customers, thinking about forming private regulation, as opposed to, in a place like the United States, pursuing broad national legislative goals, which is obviously what the EU is much better at, right, in terms of actual supply chain regulation that affects a large number of countries across a range of different sectors. So this question of sort of finding organizational choke points, maybe, as opposed to enacting legislation, again, not necessarily in terms of that's all we're doing, but as the first step, the direction we move initially, is not towards legislation often in the context that we've been discussing, is towards finding those sort of pivot points or choke points in private entities.
I mean, one thing I can say about that is maybe just to say a little bit about how this orientation came about, because, I think in the context of this strategy being developed in the 1990s, what you have even the Clinton administration doing, right, is pursuing not legislation, but a public-private partnership, which I think says something about the nature and the extent of the sort of intensity of the neoliberalism of the times, that even government regulation was proceeding through private regulation in that sense. And so there were, of course, some efforts to introduce legislation. I think Representative, was it George Miller, was active on some of this in connection with unions. But I think it was also a very different moment for the American labor movement, where a lot of the labor movement was still engaged in very straightforwardly kind of protectionist efforts in a way that wasn't really consistent with international solidarity, right? And I think there are regulations that are consistent with international solidarity, but that wasn't always the mindset that some of the folks were bringing to the legislation. And so I think it didn't have a lot of appeal in that sense to the folks coming out of the kind of more global justice, anti-corporate globalization kind of moment. And of course, also part of it was an orientation around trying to stop the WTO and not seeing that as a place where it would make sense to try to sort of add labor standards or something, right? They couldn't even, come to an agreement on these on the neoliberal stuff, much less the, labor regulation stuff. So, and I think now, of course, it is a different moment where I do think that on the one hand, the WTO kind of style of stuff has just stalled out as well, partly because of a victim of its own successes in some ways. There aren't that many more tariffs to remove, but also, it does feel politically, globally, like we're in a very different moment where people aren't moving away from neoliberal policies, but they are appealing to increasingly nationalist justifications for things. And I think that does make international solidarity more urgent. And whether or not it opens up any political opportunities for regulation, I'm kind of dubious, though, because I do think that what instead tends to happen is instead of that producing international solidarity among workers, it tends to produce demonization of migrants. So it's a very different moment now than it was when these efforts at private regulation started. I don't know that, I mean, I'd be interested to hear if other people feel like they have a sense of what political opportunities there are. And I do think that something like the accord that Jess has talked about is probably, which is also a form of private regulation, right, is probably the remains in a lot of ways the most feasible forms of regulation.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I mean, it's a really interesting moment with the new and in process laws in European countries and at the EU level. I think it hasn't necessarily seemed like, as Ben said, that something similar in the US would be feasible. And it'll be really interesting to see how workers and advocates are able to really, and how and to what extent workers and advocates are able to take advantage of the EU laws to actually press for change and remedy for workers in real cases. I think that's going to be a really interesting over the next several years. So yeah, I think that would really always be the gold standard, right? As if you had the state or a collection of states actually enforcing these rights for workers. And so I think that's something we're always, watching to see like where there are openings for that. And I think at the national level, I mean, Ava's been able to do some amazing work, including like both at the national level and then also co-filing a CAFTA complaint to get the U.S. government to push the Honduran government to implement their laws. So I think that there's always that fight happening at the national level in producing countries. And then, on our side, it's a challenge to figure out how we can meet that in the US. So that's why to date, the more kind of private regulation has seemed more feasible, but obviously we would prefer to see it be genuine regulation.
Yeah, I would say I don't feel optimistic that in the next, I don't know, how far away is November, that this is the time for us to spin our wheels trying to get something in writing. When really like what we've seen with USAS is, look, these codes of conduct exist and they're really, they're very well written and they have very high standards. And it takes our movement like fighting at every turn to make sure that they're enforced. And so I think that that's such a key part of it, is just like enforcing laws and rules that already exist, because that's already such a big part of the fight.
Yeah. I think we're going to lose our translation in just 2 minutes here. So Ava, do you want to say any final words before?
Sí, claro. Bueno, agradecer, ¿verdad?
Yes, of course.
Por haber
Well, to thank
haberme invitado a
you for
ustedes. Hay
inviting
cosas
me
interesantes que
to
uno
talk
de
about these
repente puede,
issues. They're
en un espacio con más tiempo, podríamos haberlas dicho, porque
in a space with more
este tipo
time,
de
we could have
campañas nos
spoken more
dejaron
about this, because this type of
gran
campaign,
esperanza,
or
la
these types
verdad.
of campaigns, left
Y
us
hay
with
cosas que a veces
great
no las
hopes.
hemos dicho, y es por cuestión de tiempo, ¿verdad?
And
Pero
there are
sí
things
debo
that
decir de
sometimes
que
we don't say
en
because we
Honduras
don't have time. But
luchar,
I will
hacer
say
estas
that
luchas no
in
fueron
Honduras,
fáciles.
these
Después
fights
de
were not
también de estas
easy,
dos
these
campañas y
struggles.
haber introducido una
After these
queja sobre el Tratado de
campaigns
Libre
and having
Comercio, Honduras también
presented
es el
just
único país que ha tenido una
complaints
queja
against
sobre
the Free
el
Trade
Tratado de Libre
Treaty,
Comercio con el capítulo laboral.
we're the
Fue
only
una gran
country that
oportunidad
has lodged a
que el Tratado de
complaint,
Libre
that has
Comercio,
challenged the
CAFTA,
free trade agreement,
tenga
that
esa
has challenged
cláusula
CAFTA.
laboral.
Um,
Estamos preocupados ahorita
that's
que hay
that
un
CAFTA
tratado
has
que se
this
está
labor
discutiendo en
clause
Honduras
in
con
there.
China,
We're
y
concerned that there's
estamos bien
a
preocupados porque no
treaty
está llevando la
discussed
cláusula
between
laboral
Honduras
y que no
and
la
China,
permiten.
which
Los
doesn't
chinos no
carry
están
that
permitiendo
labor
la cláusula
clause,
laboral,
and
y
they
eso
don't
nos
allow
va
it. The
a ver muy
Chinese are not
confrontados dentro de
accepting, not
algunos
allowing
años
that,
si la
and
invasión
that
china
will
llega muy
have
fuerte a Honduras, ¿verdad?
serious
Pero estamos
impacts in a few
preparados para
years. And
hacer las
we know
luchas
that Chinese
de las que estamos
investment
acostumbrados a
is
hacer.
really
Yo quisiera
strong, and it's coming
agradecerles
really strong
a
for
ustedes y a
Honduras.
las organizaciones que
But we're
están,
ready for it.
estudiantes
I
que
would
están
like to
escuchándonos,
thank
y
you
decirles
all. I'd
que
like to
pues
thank the
son
students who
nuestras
are listening
esperanzas,
to us,
son
and to
nuestra
tell you that
esperanza de
you're our
lucha,
hope.
y que tenemos grandes compromisos
Like,
con
we have
esos
hope
trabajadores, con esas
in
mujeres, con
you
esos hombres que están en
for
esos centros de
those
trabajo, que
workers,
luchan
for
por tener
those
condiciones
men, for
dignas,
those
que luchan por
women who are
tener
fighting in those workers'
un buen
centers,
trato, un buen
for
ingreso, sobre todo los ingresos, mejorar los ingresos,
dignity,
porque en nuestros países, en Honduras, el
a
grave
decent
problema es un tema de
wage,
ingresos.
decent
Por
income,
eso hay
because
mucha
we
migración, por eso
need,
se van muchos trabajadores, aunque
a
tengan el
vast part of
trabajo,
our
se van del
problems is
país,
because of
y se
income,
van
is
del país
because
por
of
un tema de
poor
ingresos,
wages. That's why
porque el
we are
salario es
losing
muy
so many
bajo,
people. So
¿verdad?
many
Entonces
people are
seguimos aquí
emigrating
en esta
because
lucha muy
wages are
comprometidos, y
so
gracias
low. So we
a las
remain in this
organizaciones que
fight,
están allí al frente.
very committed
Muchas
to it.
gracias.
And thanks to the workers who are on the front line. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I think that was, yes, I agree. It would have been, we could use at least another hour for sure, maybe even more time. But I think that was a productive start to, a conversation that we can share with the people who were here tonight and the people who will watch this in the future, to think about all that's been achieved and all that still has to be achieved, as we evaluate 25 years of supply chain solidarity. So thanks so much for everyone who was able to come. Thanks again to Maria and Luis for translating. And thanks to all of our panelists for joining us here today.